Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is Church360 Ledger, Transactions and Other Daily Tasks. This will be about a 90-minute training webinar where we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty details of using Church360 Ledger on a day-to-day basis. This is the second out of 3 training webinars for Church360 Ledger where we plan to cover everything in its entirety. So if you are just joining us for this first one, you may be missing out on a few steps that get you to this point, but I'm sure you'll learn some information. My name is Peter Frank. I'm the Senior Manager of Marketing Technology for Concordia Technology Solutions and Concordia Publishing House. CTS, or Concordia Technology Solutions, is the church administration division of Concordia Publishing House, so I get to be involved in a number of different things. One of those things is working with all of our digital products. So I've been with the Church360 team for going on, 8 years now. It's been a long time. Church360 Ledger was launched a couple years after I started, so I've been with that the whole way through. And we continue to make improvements and tweak things just to make it better. My contact information is on the screen. The best way to reach me is through my email address, peter.frank@cph.org. This is the second out of 3 training sessions. So yesterday we covered cash basis accounting basics. That's a tongue twister. And we also did the account setup. But now today we're getting into transactions and other daily tasks. Tomorrow we'll be looking at reconciliation and reports, kind of those month-end, year-end sort of processes. But today is all about the here and now. How do you process transactions on a day-to-day basis? A few housekeeping items before we go too far. I plan about 75 minutes for presentation. Now, the last 15 minutes will be saved for question and answers. I'm notorious for going over my presentation time. But thankfully, I'll be able to answer some questions as we go, and I'm willing to stay later if that's what it requires. This recording will be shared. That's one of our most common questions. So you don't have to worry about asking that. I'll be sending this out in an email tomorrow morning. We do have all attendees muted, and it looks like we've got a large group here today, which is exactly why we do that. We can't all be speaking on top of each other. Otherwise, it's not going to be helpful to anybody. So you all are muted. I'll be the only one talking today, but that doesn't mean I don't want your participation. So please ask questions throughout. You can put them in the GoToWebinar questions panel that you probably are seeing there next to this presentation. One of my associates, Jordan, is on the line. He's on our support team. He'll be happy to answer any questions as they come up. One of the things that's great about having Jordan here is that he'll be able to evaluate whether it's a question that's meant for the whole group or if you should call into support and get that unique answer that's really because your question is specialized to your church. I always make a few assumptions about everyone who attends the webinar before I get started. So my first assumption is that you are a brand new user to Church360 Ledger. I know that's not the case for everybody, but that's the level I start out with these presentations, with these training webinars, is that we start out at ground zero, work our way up. So there's some things here that you'll probably already know, but I'm hoping that there will be a little bit for everybody, and for some people, more than a little bit that is new. I do also assume you have full access to all features, that administrator role. It's easiest to show everything, knowing that some of you don't have access to all of these things. But if you see that it's available, you at least know that you don't have access to it because of your role. It's not that the feature doesn't exist at all. So that's why we show you everything during these webinars. I'm also assuming you're not an accountant. I am not an accountant. Jordan's not an accountant. We have accountants on our team that do accounting for CPH, and we use them as advisors. And so whenever I have a really tough question, I go talk with them. But I am not the expert on accounting. I know how to use the software. And I'm assuming you're in that same boat, where you are either a volunteer treasurer or you're working as a financial secretary or some financial role at the church, but you're not a full-time accountant. If you are, fantastic, but that's not really common in churches. I'm also assuming you attended the first session of this training series. So whether you're watching live and that was yesterday, or you're watching the recording and it's in that playlist, I am assuming you've seen it. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to get value if you didn't see that first session. It just means that I'm going to go over some things very quickly because I covered them yesterday. And there's another session tomorrow, or session 3 if you're watching the recording, There's some things that I'm not going to cover today because that's on the agenda for tomorrow. My training goal for today. By the end of the day, you'll know how to enter all the different transaction types and also manage payees. Now, there's a few other little things I'll show you along the way, but that's the bulk of the presentation today. My outline. Transactions is going to take up most of the time, and that includes transfers, deposits, payments, checks and check queue, journal entries, and we'll also talk about how to void transactions and edit transactions. Then we'll get into managing payees. So this will really fill out our account. Yesterday we set up all of the structure, or at least a lot of the structure. We didn't go through the entire chart of accounts because that would have taken too long. So we may add a few accounts as we go, or as examples come up, I may have to adjust some things to accommodate those examples. But if you have not already started your free trial, I encourage you to do that right now at 360ledger.com. That way you can follow along with us. If you already have an account, great, but I don't want you to be left behind if you don't. So feel free to start a free trial right now at 360ledger.com. And while you do that, I'm going to go ahead and log into the software. So I'm going to switch my browser window. I do apologize if you do hear any noise in the background. We have a fantastic facilities team who's working on the ceiling outside my office. I do have my door closed, and so it will be quieter than it would be otherwise, but you may still hear a few things in the background. Just bear with us. They've been great to work with this last week. They've been working on it, and they haven't really been that loud, so you may hear things occasionally. All right, well, we are on the home page of our Church360 Ledger account. Now we've got some numbers up there. We've got accounts on our chart of accounts, but we have no transactions yet. Yesterday we didn't enter any transactions at all. So what I did yesterday is I went through what the user interface looks like, and primarily we worked under chart of accounts. So I'll go under settings and chart of accounts to show you. We have our asset accounts set up with some restricted funds. Those funds are set for very specific purposes. We've got our liabilities where we have a building loan and a CPH house account. Now, what I'm also going to do right now, just to give an example of how to create an account, I'm going to create a credit card account. So if I create a new account here and I call this the Church Credit Card, and then I'll put in a number 2-1005 and a 0 initial balance. Submit that. Save those changes, confirm. And now we have a credit card account. We have our income, how we receive cash into the church, and we have expenses, how cash goes out of the church. So we've used this example of Vacation Bible School because it's a really good example in my opinion. It covers all the different types of accounts. And so these transactions that we're going to do today are based on that. So we're going to look at purchasing items for a Vacation Bible School. The first thing we're going to talk about is transfers. So that's where we're going to deal with assets. Now you can transfer funds across other transactions as well, meaning that if you want to, if you need to move money from one income account to another, maybe it was miscategorized, you could do it in that way, but I'm going to show you a different option for that. So really for transfers, what we're looking at today is bringing money into our initial accounts. So for example, we have our American Bank category that has a savings account and a checking account. And within a checking account, we have an unrestricted checking account where these are funds that are available for anything. And then we have our VBS account, which are funds specifically for VBS. So we've got about $2,000 there of initial balance, but we may need more depending on how large our VBS is. So what we'll do is we'll transfer dollars from our savings account into our VBS account. So we've got a lot of money in that savings account, and we can spare a few thousand to move over into VBS for that specific purpose. So before I get too far, that's going to be our first example, and then we'll get into a few others. But I want to talk about the new transaction screen. Up here in that top right corner, in that secondary nav, to the left, we have our omnibar, which shows all of our individual accounts. To the right, we have our new transaction button. Now, new transactions give you different transaction paths. If you're familiar with credits and debits, and I thought I had a slide about that, but I realized that I left that out. So I can always pull that up in just a moment. Hang on just a second for me. We'll go right back here so you're not looking at that. Let's log into the software. So credits and debits are something that accountants certainly know a lot about, and I'm not going to claim to be the accountant. I'm not going to claim to be training you on financial terms or anything like that, but I do want to give you a little bit of a background on what this looks like. So let me go ahead and put this into my presentation. And I will, oops, looks like the text came over as black, which is not helpful to me. So pardon me just 1 second. I should have this all prepared. The problem is that I put it into yesterday's presentation and realized it was the wrong day, but never went back to fix it. So that is on me. I apologize for that. But I'm just about there. And I think this is going to help things make a lot more sense. There we go. So that is their credit and debit chart. You'll notice that we have our 4 account types on the left-hand side: assets, liability, income, and expense. We covered them in quite a bit of detail yesterday. Then we have our debits and our credits. Now, a debit will interact with an account in multiple ways. That'll either increase or decrease that account. And the reverse way for each account type is a credit. So for example, under assets, if you debit the account, it will increase the account. And if you credit it, it'll decrease it. Now this is using cash basis accounting. And so this is specifically for this set of accounts. But I think what you'll see as we go through that this will make a little bit more sense in terms of what's happening. Now, when you make a transaction, like we'll be doing in just a moment, all you're doing is making what's called a journal entry, where you are using debits and credits to adjust the balances of multiple accounts. So it gets very technical on the back end of making sure that each account is either debited or credited correctly. But we've created these transaction paths so that you don't have to think about this. You know, this information here is burned into the brains of accountants. But for those of us who are not accountants, when we get into this, this is almost like speaking a foreign language. That's why we have Church360 Ledger doing these kind of things for us. So when we look at a transaction, we're going to go to transfer. We're going to do new and then transfer. You're going to get a screen that looks kind of similar to your checking account or your checkbook. Now, for those of you who are younger, you may not be that familiar with what a checkbook looks like. I know that I grew up using a checkbook, but quickly moved to a debit card and haven't really touched my checkbook much over the last 10, 15 years. You know, I still have it. I still write checks once in a while, but it's not very frequent. But we designed it to be familiar so that it looks like that, although it's not actually a check. In this case, we're talking about a transfer. So you'll see up at the very top here, we have a memo. What this memo allows you to do is write any details about the transaction. And you can put as many words as you need to. We recently opened that up. It was a very short number of characters. We had a lot of questions about why that was. As we looked at it, we realized really the only reason we limited it is because of where it showed elsewhere in the software. We could put as much as we want and still limit what shows on the line items. So I'll show you that in just a few minutes. But what we're going to say here is transferring $3,000 from our savings account to the restricted VBS account in the checking account. Lots of account, let's say the restricted VBS fund. And then we select the date. Now this date should be the date the transaction actually occurred. It'll default to today's date, but let's say you did this at the bank yesterday. So we'll put that back on May 18th. Now we have two options here for accounts. Typically what we do with any of these accounts is the first one you put in is saying where the money's coming from, and then the second one is where the money is going to. So in this case, we're going to move $3,000 from savings to the restricted VBS fund. If you have that kind of understanding that this is the source and then the one on the right is the destination, I think that's going to help because that's how the credits and debits work. So for example, the savings account, I'm going to select savings. Now, one thing that has changed is that let me clear that back out. Here, I'll copy this. I should have shown this. We'll go to deposit, transfer. All right, if you look right here on this left side of the transaction, it says asset, expense, income, or liability. That's the type of account you can choose. Well, as soon as I select this first account here, that's an asset account. Now it limits it to just asset. And on the other side, it limits it to asset too. Because a transfer is taking dollars from one account type and moving it to another of the same account type. And so we're moving it from one asset to the other asset. Now, like I said before, you could do this with any type of account. Typically, you're going to see this with assets. So let's move $3,000 from our savings account into our restricted VBS fund. When I select that fund, now down below, you'll notice what's called a T chart. This is the listing of accounts and the debits and credits associated with it. So the first one is our savings account. You can see that's being credited $3,000. Well, let's go back to our definition here. If we credit an asset account, we are decreasing that. And if we debit an asset account, we're increasing it. And so as we look at this, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to credit or decrease our savings account and debit or increase our asset. Now, you didn't have to go back and look at your credits and debits to figure out which one was what because of how we laid out the screen. So that's how this transfer screen works. So if I go ahead and click Save, that transaction was created. Now, if you look here, now I'm at $247 in my savings account and $5,000 in my VBS account. That shows those dollars have transferred over. I can also go back to my accounts view by clicking the Ledger button. And when I go and I change my date range and I say it is May, now I start seeing some transactions. Now, these journal entries were initial balances from yesterday. I did do one transfer yesterday, bringing 2,000 in, but here's a new transfer. Now, this kind of transfer is going to be reflected at the bank because I'm moving it from one bank account to another. You can use this transfer within the same account. That's what we did here. We went from the unrestricted account or unrestricted fund and checking and moved it to the restricted fund and checking. Now, the bank never needs to know the difference because this is just how we're taking those dollars that are already in the bank and dividing it up by accounts. So in this case, you wouldn't go to the bank and actually do a transaction. In our first example, we did because it's moving from one bank account to another. And in most cases, you're going to have some sort of record at the bank level of transfers or deposits or withdrawals. That's just kind of how that works. All right, I'm curious if this is making sense if I'm going into too much detail. So if you're having any questions, please go ahead and put it into the chat. And I've been presenting a lot these last few weeks. I'm slowly losing my voice, so pardon me as I grab water throughout the presentation. So that is our transfer type. I'm going to jump down under new transactions and go to journal entries. What I want to show is how similar a journal entry is to any other transaction. If I wanted to do this same transaction, I could paste my memo in there. I have an optional payee. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then under account, I could pick my same accounts as before, savings account and VBS account, and I'll credit my savings account, and I'll debit my VBS account, and it'll create the exact same transaction. You'll notice that each of these sides, my debits have to equal my credits. And when it does, those boxes on the bottom turn green. So if I only did 2,000 here, I would be off and it would be red. It wouldn't allow me to save it. So that's where these have to come in. But I hope this clarifies that that transfer that we did is nothing more than a journal entry on the back end with just a different way of approaching it. All right, now I can go up here and change my type to a deposit. When I do that, my memo still stays the same, so I'm going to clear that out. A deposit is when you receive money from an outside source and add it to your bank account. Now, you can't do a transfer because it's an outside source. You don't have any place to transfer it from. Therefore, it becomes an income and asset transaction or deposit. Now, that made it sound more difficult than it actually was. You know, a deposit is just putting money into your account. So Debbie just asked, what's the difference between a transfer and a journal entry? You'll probably have that same question. What's the difference between a deposit and a journal entry? There really isn't. Every transaction is technically a journal entry. You are just adjusting your balances. But what this is doing is that by these transaction types, whether it's transfer or a deposit, you're limiting your options on what type of journal entry by restricting the account types. So we are taking you a couple steps in the process. The end result is essentially the same as far as the accounting is concerned, but the way you get there is different, and hopefully, theoretically, it's easier. Let's take a look at this deposit example. Let's say we received a check for our offerings. We'll say multiple offerings. We received offerings for our Sunday worship, and some of that was to the general fund and some of it was to the VBS fund. So we'll say offerings for 5/17 worship. And we'll put that as to yesterday too. We went to the bank yesterday. That's when the actual deposit happened. Well, payee shows up here. We don't have to worry about payee with most deposits unless we are getting maybe a credit back from an organization. If you are doing offerings like we're doing here, that is all handled through Church360 members. So you don't actually have to worry about putting a payee in. And we mark it as optional. So the next thing it says, what's your asset account here? Where are you putting this money? Well, we're putting it all in our checking account, but we're splitting it up from the beginning between unrestricted and VBS. So I'm going to select my unrestricted checking account. And we'll say this is $8,000. And then we also had a total of $2,000 for our VBS. So we select our VBS asset account, which is really a restricted fund underneath our checking account. That's what both of these are, is that they're funds underneath the checking account. So the bank account's the same, but we've divided it up into different funds. Well, where is this money coming from? That's when you look over here and it says there's an income account that you need to bring it in from. Well, we have multiple income accounts. Income accounts tell you the purpose of the money you have received. So for example, the general fund is for all things that are unrestricted. So we'll select the general fund, and in this case, it's $8,000. Now you'll see here on the right, it gives you $2,000. It says what amount needs to be accounted for to make this a balanced transaction. So it takes the total on the left and it subtracts the total on the right and says, oh, there's $2,000 left before you can complete this transaction. So I go to underneath general fund to a new line and I select my VBS fund. Now, again, this is being filtered down. The only accounts I can put in here are actual income accounts because that is the type of transaction I have chosen. That doesn't mean that, oh, I couldn't go and do this as a journal entry. It just means that it is limiting it as I enter so I get the transaction right. That goes back to what we talked about yesterday of preventing the well-intentioned from making mistakes. You don't want to accidentally add an expense account on here or a liability Now, there may be some cases where you do need that, and that's where a journal entry comes in. But for most cases of deposits, you're dealing with assets and income. And so we restrict it to those two. So now I select my VBS fund for income, and you'll see there I have a balanced transaction of $10,000 on each side. I'll go ahead and click Save. Now you'll see here the type is showing as deposit, and we had some initial balances that are journal entries. Well, these are all technically journal entries, but the way we got to them is different, and so we categorize them different so you can look them up easier. But otherwise, it's always the same, and when you click on a transaction, you can see the debits and credits exactly as we planned, but we didn't have to think through that process. It just gave us that path. So that's a deposit type. Let's go to new transaction and go to payment. Well, what's a payment? Well, most of you probably know what a payment is. That's money leaving your account and going to somebody else. So you have to deal with an asset and you're paying it off to somebody else. So let's go with the most basic type first. Let's say you had your electric bill and you said, all right, this is our electric bill for April, we're gonna pay it. So the first thing is the memo. We'll say April electric bill. We'll put the date of 5/19, and then we'll go to a payee. Who is receiving this money from you? Well, here in St. Louis, Ameren Electric is the company that's receiving or taking care of all our electricity. Well, I can type that name in, and if I start typing in there's somebody in the system, it'll show up for me. But in this case, we don't have any payees here yet. So when I type in Ameren Electric, oops, I hit enter. I shouldn't have hit enter, I should have hit tab. It's going to create Ameren Electric as a payee. So Ameren Electric. When I complete that transaction, Ameren will be now a payee. Now the next thing I do is say my asset or liability. We'll get into a liability transaction in a moment. But my asset, let's say I'm paying this directly out of our checking account. This would now go under unrestricted checking. You'll notice I can't just select checking account because our checking account has been divided with restricted funds. So checking account is hidden, but our unrestricted is where we want to pull it from because that's everything that doesn't have a purpose. So we'll say that, we'll say $125. It's a pretty cheap electric bill. The next thing is it an expense or a liability? Well, in this case, it's just an expense. We're paying for electricity. We'll talk about liability in just a few moments. So now we have to choose our correct expense or liability account. And in this case, it's the electricity. So I'm going to select my electricity expense account. Now you'll notice on the far right that total is already there. We have to have that balanced transaction. So the electricity bill is $125. In this case, I'm not splitting this. It's just one bill for one purpose. Take it out of one asset, put it in, and pay out to the payee, mark it as an expense. So that's what we're doing here. So I'll look at all that and I'll say that looks good. My credits for my asset is decreasing my asset as you would expect. And then my debit is increasing my expense. So I have one on each side of the transaction. It's a balanced transaction. I'll go ahead and click Save. There we go. Now we'll let it flow in. There it goes, payment for Ameren Electric. Now you notice there's only one line here. On the home screen, you see assets less liabilities. That's why we don't see the expense line, but it is there. And if we click on that transaction, you will see it right there. All right, let's go and talk about checks. So we have a new transaction type. We've gone through transfers, deposits, and payments, and now we're on to checks. Well, what is a check and how is it different than a payment? In a check, just like a payment, you have a payee. You're taking money out of an asset account, sending it to that payee and marking it as an expense. So that's a payment, right? Well, no. The only difference is that you are physically writing out a check to hand to somebody, and that requires a different path because we track checks. We track check numbers, we track who's deposited their check. It's a very specific case of money being left out that is presently our church's money until somebody makes their own deposit and transfers, or deposits is probably the better word, receives our payment. So we can't do it in exactly the same way because there's a physical component to it as well. So as we look at checks and the transaction path, the memo is in the same place, just like the date. So we'll say April electricity. Then the payee would be Ameren Electric. It looks like I created 2 Ameren Electrics before. The next thing I have is a check. Well, what's the check number? Well, how do you know? What we typically see and what we recommend is that you purchase checks that are pre-printed with your name on it. But what you can do is you can purchase security checks, which prevents them from being copied or what's the right word? I don't, forged is not the word. I'm losing it. I haven't had enough coffee today, apparently. Somebody out there probably knows exactly which word I'm thinking of when you make a copy of a check, but I will keep going because my vocabulary is rather limited today as I'm talking about ledger. I'm all in those financial terms. All right, so the check number would be pre-printed on your checks, and then you would feed this in through your printer and print on top of that. It'll have your account number and everything, but your check number you wouldn't know quite yet. So we're going to leave that blank until it's time to print. Now the asset has to come out of a checking account, as you would expect. And so when I click on that, you'll notice that I no longer have access to my savings account. It's just the unrestricted checking and my liabilities. So I'll click that, unrestricted checking. And what is the amount? Well, I think before we said 125, so I'll put 150 here. Excuse me. Got the yawns this morning. It's always a little bit tough doing these morning webinars. I get up for runs at about 5 o'clock. And by this time, 10 o'clock, I'm getting tired and ready for an afternoon siesta. Unfortunately, I won't have that opportunity today. As you look here, you'll see then you have that same thing, which is an expense account. If I scroll down, there's my electricity expense one more time. It's just the same type of transaction as a payment. You'll notice here, it's crediting the asset, debiting the expense account. But in between, I have a preview of what my check would look like. This is because you physically write a check. You want to make sure that it would be correct as you would physically write it. Let's go ahead and switch this to May's electricity bill right now, just so I can distinguish between these transactions. All right, now when I click save, the transaction occurs. You see it right down there, but it says it was added to my print queue. And when I go up to the top right, you'll see a printer with a little queue number in orange saying 1 check to be printed. Well, when I click on it, I get this screen. This is my print queue. The transaction has been saved, but because I created a check, it is expecting me to print this out. Now, when I go here and I select the check, I can have 2 different options. I can either print it as expected, or if I manually wrote out the check and mailed it, I can mark it as printed by clicking this button. We'll do the print button first, and then we'll do mark it as printed afterwards. So when I click print, it gives me a full preview of what the check looks like. Now I'm going to pause here to show you something. You'll notice that it divides the check into 3 parts. The top part is the actual check. The second and third, the middle and bottom parts, have details on it. It has the name of the church. It has the payee, the date, the check number, the total expense, total deductions. That's if we use a liability account on there. Think it like payroll. It has the memo, and it has the, yeah, there it is, current expenses. All of that is listed there. That is additional information that helps you know what this transaction was. When I click print, it takes this view and puts it into a print preview mode. Usually. Did that pop up somewhere else? Must be struggling today. A lot of times I have issues when I'm presenting live because of the streaming. Things don't get fed. There it is, print checks. Things don't get fed to the servers quickly when I'm streaming. So when I go to print it, it says confirm the numbers for the following checks. Well, I only have one check. It defaults to the lowest available number, but let's say you look at your checkbook and say, okay, the next check, or your stack of checks that you're gonna print, my next check is 7244. So I'll do that, I'll click confirm. Now it takes me to my print preview, and it gives me just the words that'll be printed. So when you look at that, you see exactly how it's going to print out of your printer onto your physical check. Well, what if your checks have the check in the middle? We work with a company called Forms Plus Inc. They're based out of Atlanta area, and they provide this proprietary check format for us. And they give you two options. One where the top check has the actual detail information for your bank, some where the middle checks have it. Well, you can choose your preference. We'll hit cancel here. You can choose your preference under general settings. Oh, excuse me. I have check style right there, top or middle. If I chose middle and click save, then when I go to my print queue and go to here to print it, now the check shows in the middle. That's the difference. Well, after you print it, then you go and mark it as printed, because we don't want to assume that it printed correctly. If you need to print it again, you can click there and click print. Print. It'll ask again for that check number in case things changed. We'll hit cancel there. Go back to the check queue, select it, and mark it as printed. And it says it'll be removed from the queue. Are you sure? I'll say yep. And now I have an empty queue. Always a good place to be in. All right, next up. We covered payments, we covered checks, we covered journal entries. All of our different transaction types have been covered. But what if you have something that happens on a regular basis and you don't want to create it from scratch each time? Let's say, I'm going to go back to chart of accounts. Let's say we're going to do the church's internet. We'll come down to expenses. We'll come to operational expenses, add a new account. We'll say internet. Enter in a transaction or an account number. Initial balance of 0, submit. And we'll save it. Actually, before we save it, we're going to move it under operational expenses. Now we'll save it. Okay. Now if I go to a new transaction and go to payment, let's say I pay for my internet online. Makes sense. Internet payment for April service. And then we'll say the payee was AT&T. The assets out of unrestricted checking. Let's say it's $75. And the expense is, oops, not an asset, internet. All right, it does the transaction exactly how I need it. Well, let's say you're on a payment plan where every month is $75. It's always going to be that amount. You can go down here and say make reoccurring, and it'll say internet payment for, you can change the name. We'll just say internet payment. Maybe we'll say monthly internet payment. Every single month on the first Monday. We'll click save. The recurring transaction was created. Now you'll notice that it didn't actually create that transaction. It's going to show up on the first Monday of the month. Now I can go up under settings, go to recurring transactions, change the details on it. I want to be very clear about something. A reoccurring transaction does not get entered automatically into your chart of accounts. It gets suggested as a potential transaction that you have to then submit, because sometimes the amounts change, taxes change, days of the week change, your pricing may fluctuate. We don't want to assume it's always going to be the same price. So then come the first Monday of the month, you go here to the second icon, which is called pending transactions. Pending transactions shows you potential transactions that you can then choose to include or choose to dismiss. That's where this will show up. If you have any questions, let me know. It looks like Christy had one that Jordan just answered. She's asking about, well, we'll get into that during the Q&A. That's a little bit more detailed than I want to get into right now. All right, the next thing we want to do is look at a liability transaction. Now, liabilities can be used for a number of different things, but one of those is like a credit card or CPH house account. So let's say you bought your starter kit from your CPH house account. You called into CPH and said, send me a starter kit and invoice me. So we'll go to new transaction. We'll go to payment. We'll say VBS starter kit. Put on account. The payee is Concordia Publishing House. The asset is unrestricted checking. Actually, no. The liability is our CPH house account. $125. The expense is a VBS expense. So let's talk about what we're doing here. We're taking our CPH house account and saying, send us this product, we'll pay you later. Well, do we owe that money? Absolutely we do. I need a job still. I want you to pay your bills. All right, so that's where it comes into a liability, saying you owe CPH, or in this case, you owe CPH $125 for your VBS starter kit, which was already expensed. So let's say this happened last week. There you go. I'll click save. It shows up appropriately. VBS starter kit put on discount. So we have that listed right there. Now I could always go and set this up as a recurring transaction once a year. You don't have to use recurring transaction for everything, but if it helps you remember to do something, go for it. But now we have a balance on our liability account. You see, we'd started with an initial balance of 110, then we owed $125, so we now owe $235. Well, how do we pay that? Well, if we're paying electronically, we do the same way. We just shift who is the payee, where things are coming from. Go to new transaction, payment. I shouldn't say we shift the payee. We do put in that the payee is, Concordia Publishing House. Now we're saying, where's the money coming from? Well, my unrestricted checking. $235, where is it going? Well, it's not going to an expense. We already had the expenses hit. It's actually going to the liability. Well, liabilities are, They can be confusing, but let's pull down and see what liabilities we have. There we go. CPH house account, credit card. We're going to do the CPH house account. We're crediting our asset, meaning we're removing funds from it. We're debiting our house account. What does that mean? Well, it's a liability. So if we debit it, we decrease it. So we're decreasing our liability, which is a good thing. We're having to owe less. So now we'll switch back. We know that our credits and debits are correct. We'll click save. And now look at that graph. They peaked here, they went down to 0 there. Or I should say, it went down. That account went down. Because liabilities, typically you want to keep it 0 unless you're in between payments, but you don't want to start earning interest on liability. So we try to make it as easy as possible for you to see what that account actually owes. All right, I think that is just about all on transactions. I think I might run a little short today based on how this is going. The next thing we're going to look at is pays. Oops, let me go back to my presentation outline. Oh, I didn't cover voiding transactions. Let's do that. And we also need to talk about editing transactions. This is why it's good for me to have my outline pulled up. All right, let's go ahead and change a transaction. So let's say that we put the VBS starter kit on an account. We said it was $125, but we forgot about shipping. Typically, if you order early enough, we ship it for free, so it's usually this. But let's say shipping costs you $15. Do you want to put that completely on your CPH house account? Well, yeah, because that's what you owe CPH. So we'll put that in as 140. And now our VBS expenses need to go up by $15. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to 140. So I'm editing the existing payment. I'm changing the totals and I'm clicking, oh, I need to type in an amendment memo. Say forgot to add shipping. We'll click save. Now my actual total on my transaction changed. You'll notice down here, it now says 140. When I hover over it, it says the transaction has been edited, which is a good indication that something changed. We don't always know what it is, but if you click on it, this little arrow over here, well, if you click on the transaction, you'll see the end result. But if you click on the little arrow, you'll see what changed. 519, it changed by $50 from 140 to 125. You'll also note that it is highlighted there so that you can see exactly what you're looking at. So when you create a new when you edit a transaction, all you're doing is creating a related transaction that does something that we don't necessarily want you to be doing. And there's a number of reasons for that, but it's not good accounting to have to correct your mistakes that way. Well, let's say we now realize that our payment's going to be short. We can't pay $235. We need to pay $250. Well, I'll go up into my my payment on my liability, and I'm going to click void. Maybe we didn't send the check into the credit card company yet. We were waiting to hear what they said. I can click confirm void, and the transaction will disappear. My balance will go back up to what it was before. It's now $250 because of what we added to it. And we're in a good position to now pay it off, same way as before. So that is how you void a transaction. Let me go under reports for a second under event log. You'll notice that I actually created new transactions here, and it linked it to a revision of transaction such and such. These are internal IDs. You don't need to know these. You won't be able to export them too many places. So just know that it keeps a running log. We'll get into this more tomorrow. All right, now we can get into payees. I'm going to click this settings button, go down to payees. I have two different payees right now for electronic, Ameren Electronic. If I click on one of them, I can enter additional details. Whoops, I think that was the same one. Maybe not. This is where it gets confusing. You can also hover over and click history, and it'll open me to the right page. This top one is the one I want to keep. So I'm going to click here and delete the second one. Oops, I'm clicking all over the place. To delete it, I click the X, click delete, and now it's gone. Let's go edit a payee. If I go to Concordia Publishing House, I don't have a first or last name, so I leave it blank. I type in our address. And then any additional notes. Terms are 30 days. And click submit. Now I have more details on that payee that I can reference later on, but also, whoops, is that the right one? We'll go to checking account. There's my Ameren Electric. When I click on the transaction, nothing else has changed because all I've done is put Ameren Electric in there. But if I go to a new transaction, go down to payees, I only have those two payees available to me. That's why I said before, it's best to start typing and select a payee, or to go through your database to start and figure out who all your payees are going to be. Enter them in at one time. All right, well, that covers pretty much everything in my presentation today. Let me go back and double check it. Like I said, this one's pretty simple. I'm curious what kind of questions you have. So we covered transfers, moving things from one account type to another. We covered deposit, which is bringing in external dollars into an asset account. Payments, which is like online bill pay, where it takes money out of your account and goes to a third party. Checks and check queue, which are very similar, except you print it out. Journal entries, which are essentially any other type of transaction, but done with credits and debits. Voiding transactions, where you take a transaction that has a mistake and delete it, or editing transactions, where you take a transaction that has a mistake and you fix it. Finally, we looked at managing payees, which is a really straightforward process. I probably went over it too quickly, so feel free to ask any questions about that. All right, that was our outline. We covered things in record time. Before we get into Q&A, let me tell you a little bit about our available training resources. We have a manual as well as previous webinars on our website at 360ledger.com/training. We also have a blog where we keep updates. I just posted there the other week, 360ledger.com/blog. We also have our resource center, resources.concordiatechnology.org. There is a lot of great stuff available for you. I encourage you to go out there. All right, software support options. If you don't get your question answered today, you can put a note in the questions and Jordan or I will answer it. But you can also go to the Online Help Center, which is available through Church360 Ledger. Out of the transaction mode, but down in this lower right-hand corner. When you search, it'll give you options, and then you'll see this button at the bottom, see original article. This is also where I upload the recordings, so you can track it. Oh, sorry, not this one, resources where I upload the recordings, but this will take you to our help center. And our support team is the one who manages this. You can also email our support team at support@cts.cph.org or call them at 800-346-6120, Monday through Friday, 7:30 to 5 Central Time. A few ground rules before we get into chat. Please type your questions into the GoToWebinar chat. Remember, you cannot speak out loud in any way that I can hear you. You certainly are allowed to speak, but I can't hear you. We are emailing the recording. Typically, it's within 24 hours, but I say 48 just to be safe. And if you are watching the recording, you can send your questions to the email address, support@cts.cph.org, where you can get a personalized response back. All right, I'll leave it on this screen as I read the questions. So we covered Debbie's question about the difference between a transfer and a journal entry. But Christy had the question that says, there's only one memo line and that prints on the check itself. Is there an option to enter invoice numbers or additional notes on the check stub? Sometimes I pay several invoices at once and vendors need to know which they are being paid for or which they're being paid so they can allocate funds. Is this an available options or are there plans to incorporate this? Well, it's not right now. Let me show you what we offer. You're not missing anything. And we do have plans, but as we looked at things, it was far more complicated than we thought, as these things often are. All right, let me go back to that. So when we go to a transaction like May electricity, it's been printed. That's the other thing. Once it's been printed, I can't edit it. Let's go to April payment. So April bill payment, April electric bill. I can expand the memo quite a bit, but the first 32 characters are all that will show up on the check. And that's because of limited sizing on the check. So if you have an invoice number or an account number, I would put that as your first note. And then underneath it, you can put additional notes for you or your staff. That's how I would approach it. Now, in terms of line items at a memo level, we looked into that, and the way that Ledger rolls up transactions, just like the edited transactions rolls into the new transaction, we can't accurately give a line item for each because sometimes the lines disappear or sometimes the lines have different requirements of students. So we haven't been able to do that yet, although we have looked at it, but that's why we increased this first field so that you can have a lot longer memos. So I hope that helps for right now. We're going to continue to look at adding it at line items. Jake is saying, what is the meaning behind pending transactions? Sometimes there are dollars there and sometimes not. Is it looking for date parameters? Yes, pending transactions show up on the day that they're supposed to occur, or if you get a deposit from Church360 members. I didn't check, but I don't think we have one. That's going to be covered tomorrow in a little bit more detail. But yeah, when you get a pending transaction, it is an available transaction. Think of it almost like a template. You can have your accounts listed, you can have your dollar numbers, your memo, any of those things listed. But then what you do with it is you update the information as appropriate. So pending transactions will give you the shell of a transaction and then you submit it. So I should have had one in here to start. It's tough because it runs based on the date and says, okay, you set up a schedule. This date fits within the schedule, so here's your transaction. So I can't really show it to you right now, but I hope that explanation helps, Jake. Maxine says, is there a possibility of changing the date on a payment or check or other transaction and have that date stay for following transactions? This would be especially helpful month end. Changing the date on a payment or check. Well, once it's been printed, you can't change a date. And on a payment, you can. So if we go down here, April electric bill, you can change it. We'll change it to Monday. I'll put an amendment memo that says changed date. Click save. Now that date has changed. See, now it's 18 instead of 19. But once a check has been printed, we assume that you have sent that check, so we don't allow you to edit the check after it's been printed. So those are, I think that answers your questions. I don't understand that have that date stay for following transactions. I think you mean that the next time you go enter a check, that date would show up. It's still always going to enter today's date, not the next check date. All right. I've only seen this on deposits thus far. Jake was saying you can do it outside of deposits. We're talking about the recurring transactions. You can do that with any type of transaction, but the most common is deposits. So if we go to payment, well, we looked at that before. Yeah, maybe pending. I say deposit because that's where Church360 members comes in, but expenses or payments are also common too. All right, I hope I answered those questions. Those are the last ones I had in the queue. It's a quiet bunch today. So let's go ahead and wrap up. We got one more. Oh, Maxine's clarifying. I meant at month end, we have numerous checks and transactions that need the month end date, but the date keeps switching back to the current date. Maxine, I'm not sure why you would need the month end date for changing. It should be when you send out the check. When you reconcile the check, you can reconcile it, and we'll go over that tomorrow. You can reconcile that with the old date still in place. So I'm not sure why you need to change that. We'll wait for you to respond. And Noreen just asked a question that's really good that I should have covered in the material. Are you able to copy transactions that repeat monthly? So the reoccurring transaction is one way, but let's go to this April electricity bill. Click on that. I can go over here and say copy. You're creating a copy of a payment. I can then go and say, well, this is the June electric bill, and it was 132, not 125. The date is actually June 4th. So you can copy all the details, change what you need to, and then save it. And now you have saved your, you've created a copy of it. If we go to June, you'll see that copy. So again, that's clicking on a transaction, clicking the copy button, making any adjustments you need, and that's it. You save it like normal. All right. Well, I'm not hearing back from Ms. Maxine. She's probably typing, but if not, we can always follow up. If you still have questions, I'm curious about the month end date change thing still. That might be best for our support team. Let me put that information on there. So there you go. That's how you can reach out to our support team. Well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up for today because I don't see any unanswered questions in there. If you continue to have questions, reach out to our support team at the email address or the phone number. But first off, I apologize for giving you time in your day back. This went quicker than I anticipated. We'll take that into consideration next time we plan out this webinar series. But I hope this was helpful to you. If you have any other questions, please follow up with us. But I hope you have a great rest of the day. I'll see you tomorrow for session 3.